My name is Sadie Bennett. I was 31 when my mother died, and less than 24 hours after we buried her, my sister stood in the middle of our living room acting like grief had already turned into real estate. She had her phone in one hand, a realtor's card in the other, and that look on her face people get when they think money has already landed in their account. Then she looked me up and down, saw my old sweatshirt, my coffee mug, the same house I had been living in while caring for our mother, and said, with a sharp little laugh, that I was too lazy to deserve a place like this. She told me to get out. Just like that. As if I were some unwanted guest and not the daughter who had been there through the hospital calls, the medications, the sleepless nights, and the slow heartbreak of watching our mother disappear one painful day at a time. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't give her the reaction she wanted. I just smiled and told her that words didn't mean much, but property records did. The second those words left my mouth, all the color drained from her face. That was the first moment I knew she understood this wasn't going to go the way she had planned. But to understand why my sister thought she could walk into our mother's house and claim it like a prize, you need to know what happened 8 months earlier, on a quiet Saturday morning, when my mother set down her coffee on the back patio and changed everything with a single folder. And trust me, what she revealed that day was only the beginning of how ugly this story was about to get. 8 months before that funeral, my mother asked me to sit with her on the back patio like we always did on Saturday mornings. The Texas heat had not kicked in yet, and the air still carried that soft, quiet feeling that made our neighborhood seem almost peaceful. She poured coffee into my favorite chipped blue mug, wrapped both hands around hers, and for a few seconds she just looked out at the yard like she was trying to memorize every inch of it. I knew something was wrong before she said a word. My mother had always been steady, the kind of woman who could make even bad news sound manageable. But that morning her voice came out thinner than usual. She told me the doctors had confirmed it was stage 4. I remember the world going strangely silent after that, like every sound around me had been pushed far away. I could not even process the words fast enough before she slid a folder across the table and told me there was something else I needed to hear. Inside was a full set of legal documents prepared by Daniel Mercer, the family attorney she had trusted for years. She told me she had already made up her mind. The house was being transferred to me, quietly and properly, before anyone could fight over it later. At first, I thought the medication was making her talk out of fear, and I told her we did not need to discuss property while she was sick. But she stopped me and said this was exactly why we had to discuss it now. She knew my sister better than I wanted to admit. She said the moment she was gone, Sloan would see the house as money, not memory. She would sell it fast, drain whatever value she could from it, and move on without a second thought. Then my mother said something that landed even harder than the diagnosis. She told me Sloan was deeper in debt than anyone in the family knew. The designer bags, the weekend trips, the polished social media posts, the talk about brand clients and luxury campaigns, none of it was as solid as it looked. A lot of it was credit cards, overdue balances, and desperation dressed up to look like success. I just stared at her because some part of me still wanted to believe my sister was simply careless, not dangerous. My mother reached across the table, put her hand over mine, and told me she was not rewarding one daughter over the other. She was protecting the only place in this family that had ever really felt safe. I started crying then, not because of the house, but because I realized she was planning for a future she knew she would not be in. She told me the deed would be recorded, everything would be legal, and nobody would know until the right time. All I had to do was stay calm and keep taking care of her the way I already had been. So that is what I did. I kept working from home, took my laptop between doctor appointments, filled prescriptions, made soup, washed blankets, and sat with her through nights that felt far too long. Sloan came by only when it fit her schedule, always blowing in with expensive sunglasses, glossy stories about her latest clients, and that same perfume cloud that lingered longer than she ever did. My mother never fought with her. She just smiled, nodded, and locked every important paper away the second she left. Back then, I thought the hardest part of losing my mother would be watching her fade. I had no idea the real fight would begin after she was gone. The morning after the funeral, Sloane arrived like she was late to a business meeting instead of one day into mourning. She did not come alone. She brought a friend from the real estate world, two women carrying bins of neutral decor, and a level of confidence that would have been almost funny if it had not been happening inside my mother's house. I was still standing in the kitchen in black leggings, holding the same coffee mug I had barely put down since the burial, when Sloane walked through the front door and announced that we needed to move fast if we wanted top dollar. She said the market was still hot in our part of Cedar Park, and if we staged the place right away, she could have professional photos done before the weekend. Then she turned to me, glanced at my sweatshirt, and smirked like I was exactly where she had always expected me to be. She said I had hidden in that house long enough, pretending my remote work was a real career, and now it was time for the adults to handle things. I asked her, as calmly as I could, why she was talking about listing a house that had not even been discussed at the will reading yet. She laughed and said some things did not need to be discussed when the outcome was obvious. According to her, our mother had always known she was the one with ambition, the one who understood money, the one who could turn an outdated family home into something profitable. She said she was not planning to keep the place exactly as it was either. She wanted to upgrade the furniture, modernize the backyard, and market it as a luxury short-term rental for football weekends, bachelor parties, and private events. Every word out of her mouth made my stomach turn. This was the same patio where my mother had hosted family barbecues, where she had taught me how to prune lavender, where she used to sit with a paperback and a glass of iced tea on warm evenings. Sloane looked at it and saw a revenue stream. Within an hour, strangers were moving through rooms that still smelled like funeral flowers. One of them started taking down family photos from the hallway wall because Sloane said personal items made it harder for buyers to imagine themselves in the space. Another was fluffing beige throw pillows on our couch like grief could be covered with neutral fabric. I watched one of them carry a framed picture of my mother and grandmother into the garage and had to grip the edge of the counter to keep from snapping. Then my cousin Macy showed up early for the will reading and stopped cold in the entryway when she saw what was happening. She looked from the stacked boxes to the staging bins to the strangers measuring the windows and said, very loudly, "What in the hell is this?" Sloane rolled her eyes and said she was improving the property before it lost value sitting around untouched. Macy looked at me, waiting for me to finally say something, finally stop it, finally reveal what I knew. But Daniel Mercer had already warned me not to interrupt a person who was busy exposing her own greed. So instead of fighting, I pulled out my phone and kept recording. I captured Sloane saying the house was hers. I captured her ordering people to move my things into the garage. I captured her mocking my work, my life, and my right to stay there. I even caught her telling her real estate friend that once the papers were handled, she wanted the listing live immediately. Every second made her look worse, and deep down, I knew it would matter. Still, knowing I had the truth on my side did not make it easier to stand there while she treated my mother's home like a set for a photo shoot. By the time Daniel texted that the will reading was 30 minutes away, the living room barely looked like ours anymore. Macy quietly started taking her own pictures from the hallway while Sloane strutted through the house talking about curb appeal and guest experience, completely certain she had already won. Watching her smile in that moment, I realized something important. Sloane was not just assuming she would get away with this. She had built her whole plan around the idea that no one would ever challenge her. And in less than an hour, that was exactly what was about to happen. By 4 o'clock, the performance was still going strong. Sloane walked into Daniel Mercer's office in heels, oversized sunglasses, and the kind of confidence that only comes from believing the world is about to reward you for your arrogance. She did not look like a daughter coming to hear her mother's final wishes. She looked like someone arriving to collect an asset. Even before we sat down, she was talking about timelines, repairs, and how quickly houses in our area could move if they were marketed the right way. Macy was silent beside me, and I stayed that way too. I had spent the entire drive over reminding myself not to speak too soon, not to interrupt, not to ruin the one moment when the truth would land exactly where it needed to. Daniel greeted us with the calm expression of a man who had already seen too much family ugliness to be surprised by any of it. He opened the file, adjusted his glasses, and began with the standard language. Sloane barely listened. She kept checking her phone, probably waiting on messages from the people she had already started lining up for a house she did not own. Then Daniel reached the part that changed everything. In a steady voice, he explained that the property in Cedar Park had been legally transferred months earlier, properly executed, notarized, recorded, and removed from the estate before our mother's death. The house was not up for distribution. It was not part of probate. It was mine. For a second, nobody moved. Sloane just stared at him like she had stopped understanding English. Then she laughed once, sharp and ugly, and said that was impossible. She turned to me and demanded to know what I had done. Her voice rose with every word, accusing me of manipulating our mother, pressuring her while she was sick, stealing what should have been shared. Daniel did not let her build momentum. He slid the paperwork across the desk, showed the dates, the signatures, the filing information, and then reminded her that our mother's will also included a no contest clause. If she pushed a baseless challenge, she could lose the financial inheritance that had still been left to her. That was when the color drained from her face for the second time in 2 days. The confidence vanished so completely it was almost shocking. She looked less like the polished woman who had stormed through our house that morning and more like someone realizing the ground had already given way beneath her feet. She stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor, called the whole thing insane, and slammed the office door on her way out hard enough to rattle the frames on Daniel's wall. Macy let out a breath she had clearly been holding for an hour. I should have felt triumphant, and for one brief second I did. But relief came first. Relief that my mother had protected the house. Relief that Sloane's lies had run into something solid. Relief that I would not have to beg for my place in the only home that still felt like my mother. Over the next few days, Sloane called lawyers across Austin trying to find someone who would tell her what she wanted to hear, but every answer led back to the same reality. The deed had been filed properly. The house was mine. The staging crew disappeared the moment they realized she had no authority, and I spent the next morning putting the family photos back where they belonged, one frame at a time. I carried the beige pillows out to the garage, opened the curtains she had closed for better contrast, and made coffee in my mother's kitchen, while the patio sat quiet in the soft cold of late fall. It should have felt like the storm had passed, but there was something about the way Sloane had looked before she left Daniel's office that stayed with me. It was not embarrassment. It was not grief. It was desperation. And desperation has a way of making people far more dangerous after they lose than they ever were when they thought they were winning. Thanksgiving was only a few weeks away, and deep down, I knew my sister was not done yet. Thanksgiving at my grandmother Evelyn's house had always followed the same rhythm. Someone was always running late. The turkey always came out looking better than anyone expected. And my mother's cornbread recipe somehow ended up being the first dish everyone reached for, no matter how many other sides were on the table. That year, though, everything felt slightly off before dinner even started. The air was too tense, the smiles too careful, the conversation too polite. We were all pretending the explosion at Daniel Mercer's office had settled things, but nobody really believed Sloane would disappear quietly after being told the house was never hers. Still, when her car pulled into the driveway right as we were about to sit down, a hush moved through the room so quickly it was almost physical. She came in dressed far more simply than usual, wearing a wrinkled cream blouse, little makeup, and an expression that looked worn thin by sleepless nights. For the first few minutes, she acted almost normal. She hugged Grandma Evelyn, muttered hello to the rest of us, and sat down like she still belonged at that table in the same easy way she always had. I almost let myself believe she had come to make peace. Then the sweet potatoes were passed. Someone mentioned how much my mother loved hosting Thanksgiving, and Sloane looked straight at me with that old bitterness creeping back into her face. She said it was easy to play the devoted daughter when I had been handed the biggest piece of the inheritance. The whole table went still. I set my fork down and told her the house had not been handed to me. Mom had made a legal decision months before she died. Sloane gave this cold laugh and said legal did not mean fair. She said everyone knew our mother would never have done that unless I had gotten into her head when she was sick and scared. Macy immediately snapped at her to stop, but Sloane was already too deep into it. Once she started, everything poured out. She admitted that before the funeral flowers were even gone, she had already been in talks with a short-term rental management company called Blue Cedar Stays. She had promised them access to the house, pitched the patio as an event space, and practically built her escape plan around turning our family home into a high-end weekend rental. She said she needed the advance money to catch up on debts and stabilize things with clients before moving to Los Angeles for a fresh start. She said it so fast and so angrily that for a second even she seemed surprised by how much truth she had just spilled in front of everyone. Grandma Evelyn lowered her glass and looked at her in a way I had only seen a handful of times in my life. She was not loud. She did not need to be. She said Deborah had not made that choice because she loved one daughter more than the other. She made it because one daughter saw a home and the other saw an invoice. Sloane's mouth tightened, but Grandma was not finished. She reminded her that this was not new behavior. Even as a child, Sloane had a habit of claiming first rights over anything sentimental just because she was older, louder, or wanted it more. She brought up the old family photo wall, how Sloane once insisted every picture with her in it belonged to her alone, even though those memories belonged to everyone. It landed hard because it was true, and everybody at the table knew it. Sloane slammed her hand down so hard the silverware rattled. Wine tipped across the tablecloth. Her eyes filled, but not with shame, with anger. She said no one understood the pressure she was under. Her clients were disappearing, her cards were maxed out, and she had spent years building a life that was now cracking beneath her. She said the house was the one thing that could have fixed it. That was the moment I finally understood just how dangerous she had become. She did not want the house because she loved our mother, or missed that kitchen, or remembered the smell of barbecue smoke drifting over the patio on summer evenings. She wanted it because she believed she was entitled to be saved by something she had never stayed long enough to protect. When Grandma told her that entitlement was exactly what had cost her everything, Sloane pushed back from the table so hard her chair nearly tipped. She grabbed her bag, knocked over one of Grandma's potted plants on the way out, and slammed the back gate behind her. The silence she left behind felt worse than the shouting. Nobody reached for their food again right away. Nobody knew what to say. I stared out into the dark yard, watching the gate sway slightly after she was gone, and instead of relief, I felt a cold knot of dread settle in my stomach. People like Sloane were never most dangerous when they were winning. They were most dangerous after the fantasy collapsed, when they had nothing left but humiliation, debt, and the desperate need to blame someone else. Christmas was only a few weeks away, and for the first time, I stopped wondering whether my sister would come after the house again. I started wondering how far she would go when she did. The weeks after Thanksgiving were quiet in a way that never felt peaceful. Sloane stopped texting, stopped posting little passive-aggressive quotes online, stopped driving past the house like she wanted me to notice. On the surface, it looked like she had finally given up. But after everything that had happened, silence from her did not feel like surrender. It felt like planning. I threw myself into restoring the house because it was the only thing that kept my mind from spinning. I took down the last of the temporary decor she had dragged in, put my mother's photo wall back exactly the way it had been, and spent cold December mornings on the patio trimming the lavender and wiping down the old outdoor table where Mom and I used to drink coffee every Saturday. Daniel Mercer told me not to take any chances, so I changed the locks, upgraded the alarm system, and added cameras at the front door, back gate, driveway, and kitchen entry. At first, I felt ridiculous doing all that for my own sister. By the second week of December, I did not feel ridiculous at all. I felt prepared. Then, on December 23rd, the whole thing turned from family drama into something uglier. Around noon, I got an email from a short-term rental management company I had never contacted. Then another one, then a third. Each message had the same basic tone, professional but urgent. They said they had received ownership documents and signed authorization forms from Sloan Bennett claiming she had the right to lease or assign the Cedar Park property. Two of them said deposits had already been discussed. One asked me directly whether I was breaching an agreement she believed had already been executed. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the screen while my stomach dropped lower with every line. Sloan had not just lied to family, she had taken the lie out into the world, wrapped it in paperwork, and tried to turn it into cash. I forwarded everything to Daniel, and he called me less than 10 minutes later. His voice was calm, but I could hear the edge underneath it. He said the documents were almost certainly forged and told me not to respond to Sloan, not to sign anything, and not to let her inside the house alone if she showed up. I asked him whether she could actually get into serious trouble for this, and after a pause, he said yes, especially if money had changed hands or if she tried to pressure me into validating those documents. That word pressure stayed with me all night. Christmas Eve morning came dark and cold, the kind of gray Texas morning that makes everything feel unfinished. I was barely awake when pounding on the front door jolted me upright. Not knocking, pounding, the kind that sounds frantic even before your feet hit the floor. When I checked the camera feed on my phone, Sloan was standing on the porch in a coat she had clearly thrown on over yesterday's clothes, hair unbrushed, one hand gripping her purse and the other slamming against the door. Her car was still running in the driveway, packed with bags and boxes like she had either been evicted or planned to vanish before sunset. For 1 second, I considered pretending I was not home. Then she looked directly at the camera and started crying. I opened the door but kept the screen locked between us. She said she needed to talk, really talk, and for the first time in weeks, there was no arrogance in her voice at all. Just panic. She kept saying she had made mistakes and things had spiraled and I did not understand how bad it had gotten. Against my better judgment, I led her into the kitchen because some small, stupid part of me still remembered the girl who used to sit beside me in the back seat on road trips and split French fries in the mall food court. The second she stepped inside, I knew I had let in the wrong version of my sister. She smelled like stale coffee and stress, and her eyes had that bright, wired look people get when they have not slept and have been thinking too hard for too long. She did not sit down. She paced. She talked too fast. She said the management companies were threatening legal action, that a client had dropped her the day before, that her lease situation in Dallas had fallen apart, that she just needed one signature from me so she could straighten out the paperwork and stop everything from crashing at once. Then she pulled a document from her bag and slid it across the kitchen island. Even before I touched it, I could tell it was wrong. It was dressed up to look official, full of legal wording and formal formatting, but it was a fake power of attorney, granting her broad control over the house and related transactions. She tried to explain it like it was temporary, like it was only to fix an administrative mistake, like I would still own everything in the end. But the more she talked, the more obvious it became that she wanted me to hand her the one thing the law had already denied her. I kept my face still and asked why any of this would be necessary if she had not done anything fraudulent. That was when the tears dried up and the anger came back. She leaned across the island and said I owed her. She said I had taken the one chance she had to save herself. She said I got to play the saint because I had stayed in the house while she was out building a life. And now I was sitting there judging her after inheriting the one thing that should have been split. I could feel my pulse in my throat, but I also knew the cameras were recording every second. While she kept talking, I picked up my phone and, under the edge of the counter, sent one text to Grandma Evelyn and Daniel. Patio. That was our family emergency word, the one Daniel had suggested after the emails came in. Sloane did not notice. She was too busy unraveling in front of me. She pushed the paper closer and told me to stop acting innocent. She said if I signed, she could fix the contracts, pay people back, get back on her feet, and disappear from my life for good. But nothing about her sounded trustworthy anymore. She did not sound sorry. She sounded cornered. And cornered people do not look for the truth. They look for leverage. Standing there in our mother's kitchen, with dawn barely breaking over the patio windows and a forged document between us, I realized grief had never really been what drove Sloane. Grief may have cracked her open, but entitlement was what filled the space inside. And as the pressure in the room kept rising, I understood that this was no longer about who got the house. It was about whether my sister was willing to destroy herself completely, just to avoid admitting she had lost. Sloane was still pushing the paper toward me when the back gate clicked open. A second later, the kitchen door swung inward, and Grandma Evelyn stepped in from the patio, her coat still on, her face set in that calm, unshakable way that had terrified people for decades without her ever needing to raise her voice. At almost the same moment, there was movement at the front of the house, too. Daniel Mercer came in through the foyer with two police officers right behind him. Everything happened so fast that for the first time since she had arrived, Sloane actually looked confused. She straightened up from the island, glanced from me to Daniel to the officers, and tried to laugh like this was all some ridiculous misunderstanding. She said it was a family conversation, nothing more. She said I was overreacting. She said the paper was only there to fix a clerical problem. But that version of the story fell apart before it even finished leaving her mouth. Daniel told the officers he had already received copies of the forged documents that had been sent to multiple management companies, along with emails showing that Sloane had represented herself as the owner of a property she did not own. Then he pointed to the cameras. Every second of her showing up before dawn, pushing her way into the house, pressuring me to sign, and trying to pass off fake authority as temporary paperwork had been recorded. One of the officers asked Sloane to step away from the island. Her whole body went rigid. She said this was insane, that nobody was listening, that she was being treated like a criminal over a misunderstanding between sisters. But by then, the misunderstanding excuse was gone. The forged power of attorney was right there on the counter. The emails were real. The false claims to the rental companies were documented. And the panic in her face told the truth even before anyone else did. When the officers asked to see what was in her bag, she hesitated just long enough to make it worse. Inside were printouts of fake listing agreements, draft authorization forms, and notes showing how she had tried to leverage the house into deals she never had the legal right to make. I stood there frozen, one hand gripping the edge of the counter while the last pieces of the fantasy she had built around herself collapsed in plain view. Sloane started crying then, but not in the way I had once imagined remorse would look. It was messier than that, angrier than that. She kept saying she had no choice, that everything was falling apart, that she only needed one break, one signature, one chance to fix what had gone wrong. Grandma Evelyn looked at her for a long moment and said, very quietly, "You had choices. You just kept choosing yourself." That was the line that finally broke something in the room. Sloane stopped arguing after that. She let the officers take the papers. She let them walk her toward the front door. But just before she stepped outside, she turned back toward me with a look I will probably never forget. It was not hatred exactly. It was the empty, stunned look of someone realizing that confidence, charm, and noise could not save her once the truth had been written down. The officers took her in for questioning on attempted fraud and false representation, and because actual businesses had been contacted and money had nearly changed hands, the whole mess moved beyond private family shame and into something official. In the days that followed, everything unraveled for her faster than even I expected. Blue Cedar Stays and the other management firms agreed not to push for the harshest outcome if she repaid every deposit and covered the losses tied to the false agreements, but the legal fees alone were enough to crush what was left of her finances. Then came the damage she had never planned for. A local news site picked up the story after one of the property firms commented on a holiday rental scam involving forged ownership claims. They never needed to exaggerate. The facts were ugly enough on their own. A consultant who sold image, branding, and trust had been caught trying to profit from a house she did not own just days before Christmas. Within a week, the clients she still had began disappearing. Calls stopped coming. Contracts were canceled. The polished online identity she had spent years building started to rot from the inside out, because once people stop trusting your name, the rest goes with it. By the end of winter, Sloane filed for bankruptcy. She left Texas and moved in with a distant cousin in Florida, far from the life she had always performed so loudly for everyone else. No dramatic goodbye, no last speech, no final attempt to blame me in a way anyone still believed. Just the slow, humiliating collapse of a woman who had spent too long confusing entitlement with destiny. That Christmas Eve, after the door finally closed and the silence settled back over the house, I stood in the kitchen and realized it was the first time in months I could hear the refrigerator humming again. Grandma Evelyn took off her coat and began straightening the chairs like ordinary things still mattered. Daniel stayed long enough to explain what would happen next, then quietly wished us peace and left us to the evening. Later, Grandma and I ate a simple dinner using my mother's good china, the set she always saved for days that mattered. We made her cornbread from the recipe card she kept tucked in the kitchen drawer, and afterward, Grandma pulled out an old family album and set it between us on the table. For a while, neither of us said much. We just turned pages and looked at the years before everything got complicated. Then Grandma rested her hand over mine and said something I still carry with me. She said my mother did not choose favorites. She chose protection. She knew that a house could survive loss, but not greed. And she knew that the people who show up quietly, consistently, without applause, are the ones who keep a family from collapsing when life gets hard. A few weeks later, once the legal dust settled, I signed papers creating a small family trust to help maintain the house for future gatherings so that no one person could ever twist it into a private payday again. I restored the patio the way my mother loved it, replanted the lavender, rehung the photos, and left the back table exactly where it had always been. On some mornings when the light hits the yard just right, I can still picture her sitting there with her coffee, watching the day begin. And what I understand now is something I wish more people learned before they destroy the very things they claim to deserve. A home is not built by whoever talks the loudest, demands the most, or arrives with the biggest plans. It belongs, in the deepest sense, to the people who protect it, care for it, and honor what it meant before money ever entered the conversation. Love may build a home, but respect is what keeps it standing, and if someone ever tries to take what your heart helped preserve, do not let guilt silence you. Let the truth stand where you stand. let the records speak. Because quiet care is never weakness. In the end, it is the foundation that lasts.